So, welcome to the second episode of Teachers in the Hall. I'm Erin Lark, and I am down to explain photosynthesis to perfect strangers.
And I'm John Zingali. I enjoy history t-shirts, bad puns, and making history relevant.
We are so happy to be back in the studio on this cloudy Vancouver morning, bringing up the topics that come up in our classrooms and meetings that end up spilling over into the hallway discussions. Before we get into this episode's topics, we wanted to follow up on a comment from last episode.
Yes, we have a listener in Brisbane, Australia, Vince, and he sent us an interesting message, and it was a lot about healthcare. Here in Oregon and Washington, we were talking about how Oregon is giving students mental health days throughout the school year, and I believe Utah was looking at doing that as well, and a couple other states. And he found that conversation very interesting because in his area of the world, it's not talked about like that. Australia is different, and they just say we treat mental health as part of health. And if students or people in general just need assistive services for that, they just go get it. And he was surprised by the fact that we're even having that conversation here in the United States. But I think that speaks to a broader context of when we talk about healthcare issues in our country versus other developed countries across the world, where the United States and other countries are not in the same space.
I think you point to something interesting. There's definitely a gap between both countries and as well as industries and business. I know that some of my friends that are in different industries have days off that are just days off. So what you choose to take your day off for is your choice. It's not something that's asked for or requested or needed to know anywhere. And I know that my sister works at a charter school in Phoenix, and their days are just their days. They don't have sick days or personal days. They just have days off. And so that's something really interesting as all kinds of industries are looking at what does it mean to take a day off? What do we need from our workers as far as documentation? And what is the purpose? And so where can we exert control, and where is control not something we do? So it'll be interesting to continue to follow through with that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So each week we also keep tabs on what's trending within education community. And I have to say that John and I have many lively debates about education, but one thing we are complete agreement about is the excellence of a quality New York pie. And this brings us to the first thing on our radar, which is a fantastic example of design thinking by a pizzeria in Canada.
For those that aren't aware, but we've all ordered some pizza and have it delivered.
Just a couple.
Yeah, just a couple, right? It's no big deal. Actually, we're coming up to Halloween, which is the largest and busiest pizza day of the year because so many people don't want to cook. But you'll be thinking now a little bit more about Carmela Vitale. And in 1983, she solved an issue when pizza boxes were stacking and the cardboard was crushing down on the pizza, and she created the pizza saver, that little plastic piece that we all find in there like, wow, what is this?
Yeah, sometimes it's round or sometimes it's sort of those little angular pieces that look triangular.
Yeah, the original, we did a little research on this. The original design was just a triangular stand in the original patent drawing and everything like that, but it solved its purpose, right? And but one of the fun things that I saw on Twitter and stuff trending the other day was this pizzeria, Boston Pizza in Canada. They sent out to their customers little miniature plastic chairs to go around the little table. And so, is it necessarily needed? Absolutely not. But I find it very amusing, and like I would save those and put them up on like my little, like it's a cute little piece of design thinking. Like it just amuses me, and it just also struck me too because our students are currently designing chairs at school in a separate project, and so the timing of all of it was just pretty funny.
Yeah, this idea of design thinking and finding something out in the world where you go, this could be different, and can I make that happen?
Yeah, and sometimes too with design thinking and coming up with things, it may not be a big problem or like this massive thing, but it could just be this fun artistic, creative thing that you want to do too, to like challenge people's thinking, and maybe those chairs end up in some sort of dollhouse of some kind or something. I don't know. Or you're playing with Legos, and there's other uses for them other than just making your pizza look fun.
I love that. They were absolutely using creativity to spark delight in customers, and that's fantastic.
So we'll be using the hashtag pizza chairs to talk about our design thinking later on. So we'll be throwing out the link to that article too on our social media, so you guys can check that out. But it gets into this other thing. It's like, what do we need to know about blank in order to solve blank? And that's a question I know I use in my classroom a lot when we do project-based learning, because there's lots of gaps and holes we need to learn about in order to solve whatever it is we're doing. And that type of thinking can really allow for students to take ownership of their learning and come up with new and different questions that maybe even I didn't even think of.
So follow that with hashtag pizza chairs. We've also been following some Twitter posts that started from a post by Jeremy Williams asking folks to weigh in on whether learning targets should be written on the board, or are they just taking up space that way? So we started wondering who is using learning targets and how. Does writing students will versus I can matter? And also thinking about what pieces need to be included in learning targets. I've heard people include what they're doing that day, use actual language from standards or language objectives, success criteria, and people on that post were kind of asking, where does it end?
Yeah, and a lot of some of the responses we actually threw a poll out there too was, what is the purpose? Who are they for? Are they for administrators? Are they for teachers? Are they for students? And I think that has a lot to do with it. And what's the best placement? Do they need to be on a board? Can they be digital? Can they just be verbal within the classroom? Even you and I have some different strategies when we talked about that. I think the biggest thing is, can they and do they help move student learning forward?
Absolutely.
So if you have something to share about learning targets or pizza chairs, we do want to hear your thoughts. You can tweet us at Teachers in the Hall, or follow us, or you can hit us up on Facebook or Instagram as well.
So this brings us to our main topic today, the value of collaborative teaching and learning for adults and for students. And this is no small potatoes.
Collaboration is an integral part of our life today. It's one of the 4 C's in education, along with critical thinking, communication, and creativity and innovation. But how is collaboration taught, or is it even taught? Do we just assume that our students can do it because they can try to communicate with one another? Do we teach norms around it? Or do we just, like I said, is it expected that our students know it? Is it expected that we know it as educators? And so I think it's something that really needs to be talked about a little bit. So that's what we'll be doing today. Collaboration can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, and it doesn't always have to come to a close at the end too. Sometimes it's also just giving someone info about their work and listening before providing feedback to them. It doesn't always have to be this massive two-way street.
And I think that it's really easy to talk about collaboration as something you do, or even some people say it's something we have as part of an identity. But I'm not sure that we always have a collective understanding for something that is, by definition, a collective process. So having a meeting does not equal collaboration. And we started thinking about, well, what does?
Mm-hmm. And what's our definition of collaboration? Because is it teacher to teacher, like preparing a project together or getting feedback on how lessons go? Is it teacher to student? Is it student to student and expecting our students to, do this other type of communication and collaboration on projects and coming up with ideas? Is it teachers to students, or rather teacher to parents, parents to administrators, teachers to administrators? There's so many different ways that it can go.
There's so many opportunities to define who is involved, so what critical partners you have in a collaborative structure. And I think that part of that definition should include a common goal as another part of that structure. It's sort of a beacon to point to when roadblocks come up, because we know that roadblocks will come up as you're collaborating.
They do. Remember, collaboration is a process. It's not just like this one-time thing that happens. We're like, oh, we collaborated. We're done. Let's go grab some pizza, and we're done. It's a process, and like I said, I know for me, there's lots of times where it needs to be continued on, and it's okay to get to that point where it's like, okay, but what we need to do is establish norms for when that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Give yourself permission to have these different activities.
Exactly. One of the things that when we were talking about this is I go back to Adam Grant's book, Originals. It's one of my favorite reads from this summer. And it talks about how to deal with creative people, but it also talks about like this idea of procrastination is okay. And it leads to more creative outputs. And I think collaboration is the same way. When we come up with project ideas or unit ideas and stuff for our students, sometimes like the first idea can be really great, but sometimes if we sit and mull on it or throw it back at another colleague from a different perspective, we're going to get different outputs, and just they can evolve and become something even better than we originally thought. Or sometimes like it might not go well, and then getting feedback on how it didn't go well allows us to adapt that and make something that we thought would be good that wasn't better, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that prioritization makes for really interesting outcomes in learning, because you give yourself that space.
Yeah. I just think you need to come up with certain norms. And so like, I know one of the things that we have is kind of our collaboration time at school. And I think about like our little Google form that we fill out, right? It's like, who did I collaborate with? What did we talk about? What came out of it? What still needs to happen? Like, that's a question on there. Do we still need to meet again? And I think that's a good place to be, because then we think about, okay, and then you and I can schedule a time, or I can sit down with other colleagues like Brad and schedule a time to keep this going. And so that, because I think, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the idea is if you don't schedule that time, the collaboration might not happen too.
I think so. You are creating value with who you are talking about, and value for the conversation, that it's worth it to continue this. And as part of that, when you understand what your clear goal is and from what lens you're coming at it, this allows you to prioritize what you are doing and say, okay, what do we have to get done today? And if we don't have to get that done, allowing for that continuation in another time and space has a lot of really good things that can come out of it, because I think innovations often happen when we're least planning for them, right? They're a surprise that came through. And if you just have mission and vision statements for groups that are laden with education jargon or synthesizing and all of those fun words, they might not be the best drivers for what you're doing. And so if you're getting really specific about why are we here at this moment, what's the outcome we have to have, then you're also creating the freedom for what can come afterward and valuing that.
Yeah, and that brings us a little bit back to design thinking. I know when I think of collaboration, I think of our time that we do 2-3 times a month that we have fixed kind of in our schedule, and a lot of it's around project design and throwing out different ideas and seeing what sticks. And sometimes it's just putting people together in a room and talking through different goals, having a teacher lead, knowing like kind of who's in charge of the project and who's supplementing different things in. Those are all kind of norms, right? So you have roles for everyone involved. There's a time constraint. Defining problems to address or look at certain standards. Who's going to contribute to these different things? How do we record the process and know like what happened and who talked about what? Because odds are it's going to need to continue, right, at some point. And so you need to have all of these things kind of written down to some degree so that we can continue that development process of a project. But then also thinking about like those are the same types of things we need to show and teach our students. Because it's like, okay, once again, time to collaborate, give some feedback on one another, like design a logo. But it's like, here, you have a certain amount of time. Like each person needs to provide one piece of information. You're going to go around and share out for a little bit. These little things that, once again, most teachers probably do. It's just thinking about them in a different framework.
And what you bring up, I was thinking about so often that we have collaboration experiences with other adults, and then we expect, that we may enjoy or not enjoy, or are able to obviously pinpoint issues with collaborative time as adults. And yet we expect it to be inherently different for students when we create that in the classroom. And so I think that one affects the other. When we see a really effective practice as adults, we can hopefully capture what made it effective and teach that with students. And the other way around, when we see what really worked with some students, that organic, awesome back and forth conversation, idea sparking, cheering on for each other, and trying to infuse that into some of our other meetings. And sometimes I know that when we're teaching, collaborative time is created out of necessity as parts of getting things of our job done that may not be our favorite, but seeing that also happens for students. And so how do they persevere through that? How do they make meaning out of a situation regardless of the purpose, and celebrate being together and the accomplishments, no matter how big, how small, or how postponed they need to be? And along those lines, in thinking about other schools and other collaboration models, I really love to see a strategy for including all voices. In thinking about that for this episode, I've been really appreciating the color brave space norms from Fakequity, and we will also be tweeting those out. Those were used at a recent STEM convening for statewide partners, and that site has really changed some of the dynamics of typical meeting space, and I really appreciate their use of norms to touch on all reasons why some people may or may not be included in a discussion. I know it may seem obvious, but how many of us have been in meetings and we have people who are either choosing to keep quiet or are blatantly left out in the proceedings? And that's got to be something that we end, because when we say we value voice, we need to put forth actions that make voice happen.
And to some degree too, then it's, if you are a teacher leader at your building, how can you help advocate for those people, right? Now, there may be people that hold a certain opinion, but they're biting their tongue just because they're not comfortable with saying it. So, like, can you...
Are those people you?
Me? No, those that know me, it is not me.
I didn't know if we were having that kind of discussion.
But, there are those people out there, but it's also then recognizing that and trying to make sure that if you know that their voice isn't being heard, trying to make sure that it is, and you have to make sure that they're comfortable with you voicing that opinion for them, and you never want to just say, well, so and so thinks this, right? You need to do it in a way that's non-judgmental and fair to them. It's not going to call them out.
And I've used that site as a personal point of growth because, like you, and part of why we get along is we are so ready to share and so ready to speak up and out about things that are important to us. And then throughout my career and reflection time as a human being, noticing times where I was ready to advocate and there was more opportunity for me to create that space for other people. So from the little things, such as I will in meetings often cover my face with my hand as a reminder that my voice needs to take a break, to bigger structures where I've decided to take notes during meetings to follow the structure and make a note of where I want to speak, and also check in as to how many other people have had that word first. So there are things that we can take on as personal agenda pieces to really make sure that we are not adding to the problem, that we're adding to the solution above and beyond norms that are maybe typical for the meeting.
And I think the big thing, too, to keep in mind is as we're collaborating and bringing in these different voices is, like as a history teacher, there's so many different voices that have been left out of the narrative. It's, we just got finished with Columbus Day. That's one of the, biggest things out there. It's you have so many different narratives out there. 30 years ago, there weren't this many narratives, and there weren't people, it was always Columbus Day. I grew up on the East Coast, and it's Columbus Day. You celebrate it, you take the day off. Out here, it's Columbus Day, or in some cases, states and cities have made it Indigenous Peoples Day, and we're looking at that from a different perspective, right? And it's trying to understand everything and be inclusive with our collaboration. We want our students to, if we don't practice that as educators, our students won't see that themselves, and then, you know, we want to make sure that every student has a voice as well. So I mean, I know this bleeds into the communication C as well, but like, if they don't have that norm of, hey, every student needs to share, right? Now, how they share might be different.
Might look different.
Right? But we want every student to share and come up with this idea, because I think we need to try to really value people's opinions. They might not, we're definitely not always going to agree with them, but we should value them, and that it becomes part of the process.
So one of the other structures that I like to use in meetings of this nature, when there are a lot of partners in the room that are working together on something, is the DataWise process from Harvard. It's a really great, very detailed structure for facilitating a collegial discussion, or almost a project. You could think of it as in that terms. And it's where you use this strong outline of key tasks to guide the work, to create some kind of output, and then to effectively share the results. And in using that kind of structure, it can help you support the norms you make, also keep everything goal-oriented, how we shared earlier, and get an outcome that, even if it's a temporary or we're putting this on hold because we need more time outcome, you can articulate, these are all of the steps that we made to get here, and here's where we're going next. And I really find that an effective program to use. And so that got me thinking about the different stories from educators that we've heard, and wonder who's doing it well. What makes it so good the way that they're doing it?
And when I think of collaboration, I'm a big music fan. And so like, I always think of collaborative space within artists. And there's certain albums, like, it's just a duet album, right? And it's like, especially like Christmas music or something like that. Like, there's like,
I love Christmas music.
You know, my wife would start listening to it last month if she could.
We're going to be best friends.
And probably has. But like, the idea of these super bands or these different things, and these artists working with other artists, and, you know, was it Justin Bieber was working with Paul McCartney, or no, Kanye was working with Paul McCartney, and people are like, well, who's this Paul McCartney guy? And I'm like, oh. But like, you know, the fact that they schedule time, they're like, hey, I like your work, right? That's how the initial thing is, like this little email. Hey, would you consider working together? And then they schedule time to meet and talk and throw ideas out. And some of these things, like the Freddie Mercury, David Bowie, just
magic.
Pure and utter magic. And that's being collaborative.
It's true. And then you talk about voices and thinking about that, when a lot of our students were really surprised when we were talking about animation films to find out that oftentimes some of the talent record their pieces of the movie, their voice for their character, completely separate from the other characters. And then it's up to the digital artists, if you will, to put that together. And the students said, well, wait a minute, don't you lose some of that magic if you're not there actually together? So it's sort of that fake forced collaboration. And maybe you do. It'd be interesting to compare some movie segments and see those that were filmed completely separately versus those where the actors came together for at least some key dialogue scenes to record.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But back onto that music piece, I know one of the projects that I don't do personally, but I have a hand in, is my friend Kat Pittman works with underserved youth in the Youth Justice Service, and goes out to prisons across the country to try to educate them. And she just does this project called Unsung, the Voices of Youth Justice. And every year, these young youth, these children, are then tasked with looking at songs and political justice and social justice. And then they get to create their own music. So they study different songs throughout history, protest songs and stuff like that. And then they get to make their own. And as someone that does judge them, it's I'm in tears sometimes, because they're understanding the process, they're getting these bigger ideas, but then they're creating something that's their own, and you know, they're hearing, and this gets back to that equity piece, is those voices are now being heard, or at least they're sharing their story, they're sharing their voice, which most of the time those students and those children probably feel like their voice has never been heard. And so like that to me is so powerful. And that's where I think we can leverage these new technologies to give voices to people who traditionally haven't had them heard.
And I love that example, and it got me thinking about what happened with another of our colleagues in Washington State, Jody Crimmins, who is a teacher in Oak Harbor, Washington, and she has been engaged in this fantastic process of first starting with a school that went all the way up through district, and they recently won an award in DC and were recognized for creating a green school environment. She used collaboration in first small among a few students, then throughout a school, including other teachers and all students, and then throughout the district to drive sustainability practices that won them these very well-deserved accolades. They couldn't have had such significant effects on their energy footprint, on the ownership of students in that process and the community at large if they didn't start small, identifying opportunity, using the ability to work together in groups that were ready to commit to the process in order to let students creatively solve the environmental concerns that were at their school, and gradually involving more and more partners that both adopted the cause and the action plans that, again, attached to that purpose and were willing to follow those key tasks. This was such a huge undertaking, and there's no way it would have reached the level of success without effective collaboration.
And every collaboration has challenges. It's normal. It's kind of, collaboration is messy, I think, but life is messy. Education can be messy. True learning is messy. And one of the things I think just people need to do is you need to be willing to like step out and share. And if you have an idea, share it with a colleague, someone that you maybe feel safe with, and get their feedback. I think this is where I know Twitter has been hugely helpful for me, is reaching out to other people across the globe and connecting with them and getting their thoughts on different things. But you have to schedule time for it. You have to keep that time sacred to some degree. Like, if it gets pushed aside because life happens, you need to reschedule that as quickly as you can. Because if you don't make time for the collaboration, it won't happen. I believe that absolutely.
You and I are examples of that in getting our podcast recorded.
Yes, we couldn't meet last week during our scheduled time, and so we met up briefly yesterday, while watching the Seahawks lose, unfortunately.
Oh, it was a sad time.
Yeah,
except for the podcast part. That was great. So you can also have issues with willingness and commitment from folks. Sometimes we get to work together and we love it and we chose it and we are rocking the process. Other times that necessity that I mentioned earlier brings you together in something that maybe wasn't your first choice for that time that was set aside. And that makes having common ground and purpose so important to drive what's happening. And we can have other limited resources, including connecting with the people with whom you need to connect despite all the technology in the world. Things may still not match up the way that you need it, and working together can really be tough. Our classroom, district, state, just little nuances within that can keep us from focusing on what kids need, even though we all know that's where we want to go. At the same time, we still have rules, regulations, structures, distance, the fact that our state is huge. These are barriers that, are not ideal, but we have to somehow create meaning and create sense making the best we can with what we're given.
Yeah. And fitting collaboration in where you can. And the thing to remember, too, is when we try to teach these skills to our students, they need to realize that things come up as well, right? So say that we have this great lesson plan. It's like, hey, we're going to give you this time to collaborate with your team, and then a kid is absent, right?
It happens.
It happens. Like, we all, been there, done that, right? And so this is where it's teaching other tools. Maybe they're just at a dentist appointment, and they can still hop on a Google Doc and talk to one another. Or they're creating a digital trail where they can collaborate, and not have to be in the same place. But if we don't teach these structures to our students, then I firmly believe that, I don't think they're innate. Like, you don't just start doing them. But if we allow them the space to do it, I think everyone is always blown away by the results.
And I think it's a fair structure to include where we ask for more opportunity for meaningful collaboration. That means of ourselves, giving yourself permission to make time. I know our time is so limited, but to say, hey, I'm going to spend this section of time on a Sunday afternoon during a Seahawks game because it's that important to have these conversations. And yes, I may have somewhere that I wanted this lesson to go with my students, but I really need to let them have this time to talk and work together, because the end result might steer you in an even stronger path than if you had chosen not to make that time.
And saying like, oh my goodness, like they did just this amazing job, but I know they're not done in their process, right?
Absolutely.
And then saying, you know what, I need to adjust my next lesson so that they can continue this. Because if we don't allow ourselves, we need to allow ourselves, but we also need to allow our students the time so that they understand what these norms are. And yeah, you may be a day or two, sometimes a week behind, but if the goal is true student learning, our goal is to get them there.
That was your golden moment when they worked together.
Right, exactly. And we shouldn't, penalize them because they're having this amazing moment together.
Or force a movement in their project that would actually be more disruptive than if they were just given that time to continue to work.
I know I've been sitting down having discussions with teams and be like, well, what about this? And it's like something, we're 3 weeks in and they had this like really cool idea, but it's like, oh my God, there it is. And so now you're reworking things, but they're excited and you're excited, and because you had that moment, and you have to allow for that.
You've got to get to that magical collaborative moment that's like a piece of music.
And it's coming up with norms and sticking to them.
Absolutely.
So, well, this brings us to the end of episode 2, but not the end of the conversation. We want to hear from you about design thinking, #pizza chairs, learning targets, and what collaboration looks like in your neck of the woods, or what you wish it looked like. I think, like, what are your visions for it if it's not where you feel it should be with your students or in your building? You can give us your feedback. Follow us on Twitter at Teachers in Hall, on our Facebook page or on our Instagram as well, and share your thoughts. We really do want to hear from you, and I think it's valuable to share these insights with all of our listeners. You can also email us at teachersinthehall@gmail.com, and we'll share some of the responses on our next episode.